Hi class, so we are up to chapter 3 and today we're going to read chapter 3 and chapter 4. So I've got myself comfy. Today I'm on the couch, got my hot drink. I've got Harley and Bella again, they're here. Bella's on the floor, Harley's on the couch next to me. So they should be quite chilled, we'll see. Harley does like to involve himself with the reading. So let's start. Chapter 3, 6 p.m. The first problem, in fact, was making Mrs. Stokes understand what a routine was. "Shoe bean," she said loudly to Stephen. "Your son has a bean in his shoe? Baked or haricot?" "No," said Stephen, sighing. He bent down to her ear, which Alfie could see was very small and poking out of her extremely white hair. She was sitting in the kitchen drinking a cup of tea that Jenny had made, and into which Mrs. Stokes had put a seemingly endless amount of sugar. "Routine," I said. "I'd like Alfie, if possible, to stick to his usual routine." "Oh, dear, dear," said Mrs. Stokes, looking a little concerned at Alfie. "I'm so sorry." "Pardon me," said Stephen. "That's all right, love," said Mrs. Stokes. "I'm a bit deaf myself." She pulled Stephen's face down to his ear and shouted at it. "I'm so sorry." "Ah," said Stephen, pulling away and rubbing his ear. "What about?" "Your son having to have a poo team," said Mrs. Stokes. "I've never heard of that before in such a young person. But, so where are they? How many people normally help him go to the toilet?" Alfie's dad frowned and whispered to Jenny, "I really don't know if we should go out and leave Alfie with her." "Why are you bothering to whisper?" said Jenny. Stephen looked at Mrs. Stokes, who was happily smiling at him. "Good point," he said in a normal voice. "Maybe I could just call it off after all." "Oh, well, okay, phone your boss, Anne." But as she was saying this, Stephen's phone rang. "It's him," he said, looking stressed. "He'll be asking why we're not there already. Pre-dinner drinks started at 6. And he dashed off into the hallway, apologising to his boss in hushed tones. Jenny exchanged a glance with Alfie. "Mrs. Stokes," said Jenny, crouching down. Alfie noticed that the older lady was dressed a little bit like the Queen, all in green with a necklace of pearls, but as if the Queen had bought her clothes at Oxfam. "Alfie doesn't have a poo team, he has routines." "Oh, I see. Where did you get them from, Top Man?" Now it was Jenny's turn to frown. "Sorry, not quite with you, Mrs. Stokes. His new jeans. I prefer Primark myself." She took a sip from a cup. "Lovely spot of tea. Can I have another?" Alfie watched all this with increasing horror. He looked at his stepmom, but she was writing something down on her phone. She held it out to Mrs. Stokes and it said, "Mrs. Stokes, would you mind please switching your hearing aids on?" The babysitter seemed to consider this for a while eventually, and she said, "Well, okay, I don't know why you think it's so important, seeing as we've been having such a lovely chat, but you're the boss. Hold on a minute." She reached into her ears with both hands and made a series of tiny adjustments to the bits of plastic inside. Her fingers were stiff, and Alfie became concerned that she might get them stuck in there. The whole process probably took about 3 minutes, but appeared to Alfie to last an hour. Suddenly there was a most terrible high-pitching squeal. "What's that noise?" shouted Alfie. "I don't know," replied Jenny loudly. "It sounds like my old Jesus and Mary chain records. It seems to be coming from her," said Alfie, pointing to Mrs. Stokes. "Sorry, dearies," said the old lady. "If I switch them both on together, they do tend to feedback a bit. Hold on for a mo." At this point, Stephen came back in the room. "What is that awful noise?" he shouted. "It's Mrs. Stokes' hearing aids," yelled Alfie. "What?" "Mrs. Stokes' hearing aids. The things she puts in her ears to help her hear." "I can't hear you," Stephen bellowed. Mrs. Stokes herself seemed impervious to the sound, fiddling and fine-tuning inside her ears again. "Do we have to go to the dinner party?" shouted Jenny. Stephen made a face, meaning, "Yes, probably, but I'm still not happy with Mrs. 2,000-year-old here." Alfie was quite good at reading his dad's facial expressions. Jenny thought for a moment and then passed Stephen the card. The old one with Mrs. Stokes' name on it and the words "in case of emergency." She raised her eyebrows meaningfully. Alfie watched his dad look at the card for a while and then come to a sort of decision. Okay, said Stephen, fine. He turns towards the old lady. Mrs. Stokes, we're going out now. Mrs. Stokes nodded and smiled, oblivious to the fact that the feedback from her hearing aid seemed, if anything, to be getting louder and higher pitched. So I'd like Alfie to stick to his usual routine if possible and definitely be in bed by... The feedback suddenly stopped, which meant when Stephen finished his sentence by saying 9:35 p.m, it was much too loud. Mrs. Stokes sat back in the chair and said, Blimey, no need to shout, dear. Stephen shut his eyes and took a deep breath. I was saying, he said, that I'd like Alfie to be in bed by 9:35 p.m. if possible, and before that to stick to his usual routines. Oh, that's no problem. Hang on, I'll make a note. She opened her bag, which smelt so much of mothballs that the moths from miles around must have flown away terrified. Nonetheless, Stephen and Jenny and Alfie breathed a sigh of relief as they watched her write. His usual blue cream, she said, holding up her pad and reading out the words, which were written in neat, if shaky, capitals. What is it? A kind of pudding, and I like spotted dick myself. Chapter 4, 6:15. Eventually, though, Alfie's parents managed to make Mrs. Stokes understand what a routine was, which meant that Stephen and Jenny could finally leave the house. They were just about to go out the front door when his dad paused for a moment by a picture in the hallway. It was a painting that had been done by Alfie's mum, his real mum, of the sea. It wasn't one of those nice but boring ones like people sell at craft fairs or some of the cottages by the coast. His dad had told Alfie, who was too little to remember, that one of the things his mum has always wanted to do before she died was to swim with the dolphins. She never got to do that, so instead she painted this amazing picture swirling with colour and movement and adventure of what the sea might look like if you were rushing through it underwater. Alfie had seen it so often he now forgot it was there. But just at this moment, his dad was staring at it like the painting had put him in some sort of trance. Dad, said Alfie, shaking his father out of it, are you sure about you going out tonight? Unexpectedly, he heard a voice from the small toilets beneath the stairs. Don't worry, it'll be fine. I'm sure everything's all right here. You'll see, Mrs. Stokes. Opened the door a little and peeked out at Stephen and Jenny. You go, you need to go. You definitely need to go. And she shut the door again. Jenny and Stephen exchanged glances. Stephen crouched down and put his hand on Alfie's shoulder. To be honest, Alfie, I'm not entirely sure. But here's the thing. If you just stick to your routines, everything will be fine. Alfie looked in his dad's eyes to see if he was telling the truth, which was quite hard as they kept looking off to the side towards the painting again. What do you think, Jenny? Said Alfie. Jenny opened her mouth to answer, possibly even to disagree with Stephen a little from the expression on her face. But Alfie's dad said, Alfie, let's not discuss it now. We really have to get going. And besides, especially if you're going to be asleep by 9:35 p.m, you need to be getting on with your having tea routine. You're already, he checked his watch, 7 minutes and 43 seconds late, laying the table. Alfie checked his watches. His dad was right. He nodded and turned back slowly towards the kitchen. 7 minutes and 45 seconds, said his dad from behind him. Oh, come on, Stephen, said Jenny. We're already late ourselves now. Oh, no, said Stephen, running out the door. And that's the end of that. So, class, we'll be looking at something involved in those two chapters in class today, and then it will be awesome and fun as usual. I'm loving the book. Right, I shall see you right now because I'm in class.